9 nights in a row. That's how long American forces have now been hitting targets inside Iran night after night in a campaign that started as retaliation and has quietly become something closer to a sustained air war. Bridges down in the south, a desalination plant was destroyed, leaving 10,000 people in 20 villages without running water. In a region already baking past 100 degrees, American troops dead in Jordan, the first U.S. combat deaths from direct Iranian fire since this war's opening days back in February, and running through all of it, a weapon that keeps reappearing every time this conflict escalates past a certain threshold. The bunker buster, designed for exactly one purpose, reaching things that are supposed to be unreachable, buried deep enough underground that their owners thought they were safe. If you've been half following the story, you probably remember the headline from a few weeks ago that sounded almost hopeful. A memorandum of understanding, a 60-day roadmap, inspectors invited back in, oil flowing again, peace, or something like it, looked achievable. That headline is not the one we're living in anymore. As of this week, an Iranian negotiator has said openly that the agreement is, in his words, effectively suspended. And the question worth sitting with isn't just why did the talks fail, it's what does it mean that a war can restart this fast, this completely, after everyone had just agreed it was over? Let's start with what's actually happening on the ground, because the pace of this escalation deserves to be laid out plainly before we get to why it's happening. Back in late June, the ceasefire held barely, but it held. Oil was moving again. Foreign ministers were shaking hands in Switzerland. Then, on June 25th, an Iranian drone slammed into a cargo ship. Transiting the Strait of Hormuz, no casualties, minor damage, but it was enough to start a chain reaction. Within days, both sides were trading strikes again. By early July, the U.S. had reimposed its naval blockade of Iranian ports. By the second week of July, CENTCOM was running near-nightly bombing waves, hitting coastal defense systems, missile and drone sites, naval capabilities described in official releases as precision strikes meant to protect commercial shipping in the strait. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard responded by threatening to choke off regional energy exports entirely, warning that not a single drop of oil or gas would leave the region as long as the strikes continued. Then it widened. Kuwait, a country not directly party to this war, watched an oil facility go up in flames after what its government described as intercepted Iranian drones and ballistic missiles. A desalination plant there was targeted too. Inside Iran, U.S. strikes hit a water pumping station and power transformer at a desalination facility in the south, cutting off supply to thousands. And on Friday, 2 American service members were killed and a third went missing after Iranian fire hit a U.S. base in Jordan. A moment serious enough that the State Department issued its first advisory of that kind since March. Oil prices jumped roughly 3% in response. Gas prices in the United States, already up over 30% since the war began, ticked past $4 a gallon in some markets. This is the part where the bunker busters come back into the picture, and it's worth understanding why. Because it's not random escalation, it's a specific kind of target that keeps forcing the U.S. military's hand. Iran's missile and nuclear infrastructure isn't sitting in the open. Much of it is buried. Tunnel networks carved into mountains, hardened complexes designed specifically to survive conventional airstrikes. Earlier phases of this war saw American B-2 bombers drop the famous 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator on the Fordow and Natanz nuclear sites, and later strikes used smaller 2,000-pound penetrator bombs against what analysts believe are Iran's underground missile cities, hardened storage and launch complexes built into mountainous terrain in provinces like Khuzestan and Kermanshah. An underground Revolutionary Guard command bunker near Tehran was reportedly leveled with the same heavy ordnance in early June during a mission tied to a downed American aircrew rescue. The pattern is consistent. Every time this war escalates past strikes on ships and radar stations and starts targeting things Iran built specifically to survive an attack, the bunker busters come out. Verify. Exact munitions used in the most recent mid to late July strike waves have not been officially specified by CENTCOM in its public releases. Treat any specific claim about a brand new bunker buster strike this week as unconfirmed until an official statement or credible outlet names the munition. So that distinction matters because it tells you something about intent. You don't reach for a 30,000-pound mountain-penetrating bomb to sink a drone boat. You reach for it when the target is something the other side is trying very hard to protect, and that usually means either weapons capability or command infrastructure. Which is why, even amid genuine uncertainty about which specific strikes in the last week used which specific bombs, the broader signal is unambiguous. This campaign has at multiple points gone after exactly the kind of hardened, buried targets that only heavy penetrator munitions can reach. That is not a symbolic war. It is a war aimed at capability. Here's the reframe, though, and it's the one that actually explains why this cycle keeps repeating instead of resolving. Everyone keeps treating each new round of strikes as a discrete crisis, a flare-up to be managed, de-escalated, talked down. But look at the shape of the last 5 months. War in February, ceasefire in April, memorandum in June, collapse by late June, full resumption by mid-July. That's not a series of separate crises. That's one war on a 5-month pause and resume cycle, because neither side has actually built an off-ramp that doesn't look like losing. For Washington, stand down without a signed, verifiable nuclear rollback looks like walking away empty-handed after a war that killed a foreign head of state. For Tehran, and this is the piece that connects directly to everything unstable about its leadership right now, backing down looks even worse. Iran's foreign minister said this week, in a rare and striking piece of candor, that he still has not personally met the country's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, months into his tenure. Only a small handful of officials reportedly have. A government whose own senior diplomat hasn't been in the same room as its final decision maker is not a government that can easily authorize a dramatic public climb down. Every time this war pauses, it pauses because both sides ran out of immediate options, not because either one built a real path to a lasting stop. So it starts again the moment either side has a reason, and lately, both sides keep finding one. Now, the honest pushback, because there's a real case that this isn't spiraling towards something bigger, and it deserves serious treatment rather than a dismissal. Trump has, at multiple points, pulled his own punches. He reportedly held off targeting Iran's oil infrastructure directly, even during earlier escalations, distinguishing between military and economic targets. This week, asked about the war's duration, he compared it favorably to Vietnam, 4 months versus 19 years, arguing, in effect, that the U.S. has accomplished a great deal in a short window. He's also said, even now, that he still believes an agreement with Iran is possible despite decades of what he's called stalling. Diplomatic channels haven't fully closed either. Oman and Iran have continued talking, at least at the technical level, about managing shipping through Hormuz even as bombs fall elsewhere. That's not what all-out, unrestrained war looks like. It looks like a war being deliberately kept within certain boundaries by at least one side. But here's the gap that case can't paper over. Those same boundaries keep sliding. A water desalination plant serving 10,000 civilians is not a military target by any conventional definition. Yet it was hit. Kuwait, a third country, not a belligerent, has now twice had its infrastructure struck. American troops are dead in Jordan, a U.S. ally, not inside Iran or Israel. Every one of those is a boundary that didn't exist a month ago and now does. And on the Iranian side, the rhetoric has moved past deterrence into territory that sounds a great deal like threatening. Open invasion. A senior advisor to the new supreme leader posted this week that if U.S. strikes continued for another 2 to 3 days, Iran would move to what he called full-scale retaliation, with no political border providing safety from Iran's forces. Hours later, CENTCOM launched its 7th consecutive night of strikes. Anyway, if this is a contained war, it's contained the way a fire is contained, right up until the wind changes. Which brings us to the actors sitting underneath almost everything unpredictable about how this ends. The leadership vacuum in Tehran itself. We've talked before about how Iran's new supreme leader has never appeared on camera since taking the role. No video, no audio, only written statements read by a broadcaster. This week added a genuinely remarkable detail to that picture. Iran's own foreign minister, in a rare interview, described learning of the previous supreme leader's death and immediately ordering the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and strikes on U.S. bases, a decision made by his own account. Without any indication he was coordinating with the new leader, because there wasn't one to coordinate with yet. He also revealed that Iran had spent the 8 months between the last 2 wars deliberately restructuring its missile production and launch systems specifically so that, in his words, no matter how much Iran fired, its arsenal wouldn't run dry. Combine those 2 facts and you get a genuinely unusual wartime posture. a country whose top political authority is functionally invisible, being run in practice by security officials who spent the better part of a year making absolutely certain they can sustain a long war rather than a short one. That's not a government preparing to fold, that's a government preparing to endure. Zoom out, and the stakes here reach well past the Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz still carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil on a normal day, and shipping through it has been declining again as tensions escalate. Brent crude climbed back above $90 a barrel this weekend. American gas prices, already elevated for months, are ticking upward again. More than 50,000 U.S. service members are currently deployed across the Middle East, the kind of footprint that turns any single incident, an intercepted missile, a downed aircraft, a base overrun, into a moment with national political consequences in Washington within hours. And every time this war widens to a third country, Kuwait this week, Saudi Arabia in strikes reported earlier, the risk grows that what started as a bilateral U.S.-Iran conflict becomes something the entire Gulf gets pulled into, whether it wants to be or not. So here's where it all comes together. The world was told back in June that this war was ending. Memorandum signed, ceasefire holding, inspectors invited in. What actually happened is that the underlying conditions that started the war in February never went away. Iran's nuclear and missile infrastructure is still there, largely intact according to the intelligence assessments that have leaked out over the past year, deliberately built to survive exactly this kind of pressure. Iran's political leadership is still functionally a black box, and Washington still hasn't defined what done actually looks like beyond until I say it's enough, standard that by definition has no external checkpoint anyone else can verify. Put those three things together and a ceasefire was never going to be a resolution. It was always going to be an intermission. What to actually watch from here, because the next update on this will move fast. First, whether the bunker buster campaign turns explicitly back toward Iran's remaining nuclear infrastructure specifically, rather than missile sites and coastal defenses. That would be the clearest signal this has shifted from a shipping lane dispute back into a nuclear disarmament war. Second, whether Trump follows through on the escalation options reportedly presented to him, including strikes on civilian and energy infrastructure he's avoided so far. That would mark the collapse of the last meaningful restraint either side has shown. Third, whether Mojtaba Khamenei ever appears in person with his own voice. Because until he does, every claim from Tehran about its intentions is coming from officials who, by their own admission, aren't entirely sure who's actually in charge. And fourth, watch Kuwait, watch Saudi Arabia, watch whether any Gulf state formally enters this as more than a bystander. That's the tripwire that turns a US-Iran war into a regional one. Because that's really the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath 9 consecutive nights of bombing. This was never actually 2 wars separated by a peace deal. It was one long war that the world agreed, briefly, to call finished. While the missile complexes stayed buried in their mountains, the launch systems stayed rebuilt, and the man with the final word on all of it stayed exactly where he's been since February, unseen. We'll keep tracking this closely because whatever comes next likely won't wait long to arrive. If you want to see it as it breaks, this is a good moment to stay close.